Hey, and welcome, Gurus, to the section conclusion of this section where we were working with Azure Firewall. I'm Chase, one of your Azure training architects here at A Cloud Guru, a Pluralsight company, and it's in this section that we're going to do something fun as we wrap up. We're going to cover a case study scenario example so that we can kind of break down reviewing the firewall components, the firewall rule types, and the firewall rule management styles that we have. So without further ado, let's get started with our Control-Alt-Suites organization that we've grown so familiar with. In reviewing this case study scenario, again, we need to think about the firewall components that go into creating an Azure firewall, such as an Azure firewall subnet, and we recommend a /26 per best practices of Microsoft. We also have that firewall resource, its public IP address, and additionally other resources depending on how we're managing the rules for that firewall. Then we need to also think about, in this case study scenario, the firewall rule types that are involved in the order of operations when evaluating those rules, our DNAT, network, and application rules, and how we evaluate those in order of operations, essentially the PEMDAS of our rules. Then we're also going to use it to review our Azure firewall management styles, comparing classic firewall rule management and policy-based rule management for our firewalls. So let's jump into our case study scenario here. We see we have our hub VNet, which we're familiar with. And then inside of that hub VNet, we have our hub subnet. And this is where our VM workload exists. And off to the side of this starts our first component of setting up Azure Firewall, our Azure Firewall subnet and the Azure Firewall resource. Additionally, we'll have a public IP address associated with this firewall that allow us to reach this firewall from places like the internet to perform things like network address translation to reach those VM resources that exist behind that firewall, and how we're going to be able to route traffic from these resources in the hub subnet is by creating that route table and associating that route table that has a route to the firewall with that subnet. And this will allow that traffic to get to that firewall where it can then be passed through the rules that exist on that firewall, be that the DNAT, network, or application rules, or in a policy-based rule management style, rules that exist on the policy that are abstracted away from the firewall resource itself. Now, all this talk about the firewall rules brings us into talking about and reviewing those firewall rule types. Again, with our firewall rules, regardless of whether or not it's a classic rule management or policy-based rule management, we have our DNAT rules that exist in a rule collection. We have our network rules that exist in a rule collection, and our application rules that exist in a rule collection. And each of these has a priority whenever they're compared against rules of the same type in a different rule collection. However, when we're evaluating these rules, DNAT rules first, network rules second, application rules last. And when we have a matching rule, the traffic is terminating. That's something that's important to remember. The traffic terminates. Now, let's talk about the types of rule management. Just in review, we have our classic rules, and this is where the DNAT, network, and application rules exist on collections on the firewall resource itself. And so we have to manage each firewall independently of one another, increasing our administrative overhead, which is not necessarily something that we want to do. We don't want to have to manage those firewalls independently. But this is the problem that policy-based rules fixes for us. With policy-based rules, we get to have a Azure Firewall Manager resource and the policy-based rules to manage the policies in the firewalls so that the DNAT, network, and application rules exist in rule collection groups and rule collections, and those rules are on a policy, and the firewall is its own resource, and so that we can centrally manage all this from Azure Firewall Manager and associate policies with firewalls. And we can also have a parent-child relationship between multiple policies inside of the same region as we saw in our demo. All right, Gurus, that covers all of the key things that we want to take away from this section. Now, just quickly at a high level, we'll talk about the lessons that were involved in this section before we cut away to the next section. So for this section, design, implement, and manage Azure Firewall, we had a lesson where we covered the Azure Firewall concepts. Then we had a demo lesson of implementing Azure Firewall resource. Then we had a lesson where we covered Azure Firewall rules and policies for the different types of rule management for Azure Firewall. Then we had a lesson where we implemented Azure Firewall rules for classic rule management and implemented Azure Firewall policies for policy-based rule management. That concludes this section of the course, Gurus. Thanks so much for sticking around in this section. I look forward to seeing you in the next sections.